public presentation on plant communities with Carol Nickberg and Mandy Saul, UC Master Gardeners, and welcome to that. Carol, why don't you move to the next slide? And
yeah, I am. Hold on a second.
Right.
This is, it's not letting me. I am so sorry. This.
Oh, that is because, could we make her a co-host there?
Okay, let's see.
Maybe Denise can do it. Denise, can you?
Carol, what is your...
There we go. Okay.
We got it.
We got it. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Worked here during the dry run and now live, of course, it's going to glitch out. Okay.
I'm sure all of our viewers will understand that. So we're a little still, this is our third public presentation on Zoom, and we're still learning things as we go. So here's some housekeeping that I'd like to introduce Denise Pinard, who is our kind of Zoom keeper for this meeting, and Denise can go through some Zoom housekeeping for us. Denise?
All righty. So on behalf of the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Cruz and Monterey counties, I'd like to thank you for being here today for our program, Plant Communities, Our Gardens as Habitat. Before we get to that, a couple of the usual requests and reminders for Zoom. So please keep your microphone muted and your video off. You can use the speaker view so that you'll see that beautiful slides in a great big format for you. If you have any technical questions, I'll be happy to help you with that. You can message me in the chat and I'll get you up and running. Let's see. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat as well, and we'll be able to answer those during our Q&A sessions after each portion of the presentation. This event is being recorded, so you'll receive a link to that recording in a few days after the class. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Trink.
Great, thank you. And let's go to the next slide then. Carol?
Are you seeing it?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good.
Very
Okay, thank you.
So we just wanted to tell you all a little, those of you that are, we have both master gardeners on this call and members of our public. So who are gardening enthusiasts, I'm sure. So I just wanted to tell you a bit about who we are as the UC Cooperative Extension's Master Gardeners of Monterey and Santa Cruz County. UC started a Master Gardener program a number of years ago, back when they had their farm advisors starting to get a lot of questions from home gardeners. And they said, you know, we need to be able to help these home gardeners as well. So they created the Master Gardener program. And we're talking, I think, 40, 50 years ago. I don't have that date right in front of me. To extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to the home gardeners. And so we master gardeners go through an extensive training program, and then our primary goal here, as it says, is to reach out into our communities through programs, through demo gardens, through events, a hotline, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and various kinds of information to help the home gardeners take the information from the UC programs about agriculture that the farm advisors do and take it out to the home gardeners. So you can always rely on our master gardeners as giving you science-based, research-based information. So let's go to the next slide then, Carol. Carol?
Okay, I'm here and I'm sorry, for some reason it is not, did something switch out on the co-hosting, or is it on, nothing's happening again? There we go.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, now okay, my apologies. I've figured out the problem now.
Okay,
Okay.
good. No, good. Okay, so we have two wonderful Master Gardener instructors today. Carol Nickbarg has been a Master Gardener since 2012, and Mandy Salm since 2014. So a lot of us Master Gardeners have been around for a while. Carol has a really lifelong love of the natural world and its habitats, and has really become quite an expert on native gardening. She's presented in pruning for Master Gardeners and other organizations, and she's been a great volunteer down at Elkhorn Slough, focusing on stewardship and restoration. She's a great pruner, landscape consultant, and just deeply knowledgeable about our native habitats. So you'll love hearing from Carol. Mandy is also a lifelong interest in natives and the role they play in our environments. She propagates natives, which is not always easy to do. So, you know, she knows that well. And she's done that for our plant sales and for the Native Plant Society. She's volunteered with state parks to restore habitat, and with the Master Gardener program at Lester Roundtree Native Garden down in Monterey. I also just want to add, Mandy is an incredible artist, and you might see some of that in her picture there, but she takes that creativity of her art back into her gardening as well. So I think from that, I am now going to turn it over to Carol, and Carol, you can just go ahead and go into your slides, and if you're able to turn your video on, that would be great so people can see you as well.
Okay, I'm just going to hold off on the video for the moment,
Okay.
but thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who's attending this morning. We really appreciate it, and it's a fantastic turnout for us, so thank you very much. All righty, so we'll just start in. Our Tri-County area of Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz counties contains 59 different plant communities. We have numerous forest, woodland, and shrubland communities, among others, each of which is beautiful in its own right for the plant and wildlife species it hosts. Aside from the beauty of these plant communities, the interactions between plants, wildlife, and the physical environment initiate and sustain numerous natural cycles that benefit wildland and us. So when we borrow from local plant communities to integrate their plant species into our gardens and mimic the architecture of their vegetation, we become more active participants in these natural cycles. With thoughtful engagement, we can help restore cycles that have become degraded, reestablish continuity of habitat between developed and wild spaces, and contribute to the beauty around us. What you're seeing in the photos below, on the left, a couple of bush tits in a thicket of monkey flower, and on the right is a syrphid fly, which is a wonderful insect for keeping numerous pest insect species in check. Okay, so what we're going to do this morning, just go through this really quickly. We'll talk about what a plant community is, what we mean by vegetation as architecture, what it means to mimic a plant community, and then we're going to do a day trip through 6 plant communities, talk a little bit about Mediterranean plants, considerations for your garden, and just a few little things about, at least for my topics under this, special topics, and then we'll pretty much wrap up with resources and references. All right, so what is a plant community? It's a group of plant species living together and linked together by their effects on one another and their responses to the environment they share. Typically, the plant species that co-occur show a definite association or affinity with each other. Plant communities can be grouped across 4 vegetation types: forest, woodland, shrubland, and herbaceous. And these vegetation types are defined by the dominant plant type that is present. So within a forest, the trees are the dominant ones. Within woodland, trees still tend to be dominant, but in a different way. In a shrub, in a woodland, in a shrubland, shrubs are going to be dominant, and in an herbaceous, non-woody plants are going to be dominant. So the amount of ground that's covered by the uppermost canopy or layer of any of these kinds of plant types is what tells you the vegetation type. So to make this a little bit less confusing than how I just read all this. So in this lower left, in the background, there's a eucalyptus forest, which is actually a plant community, even though it's not a native one per se. You've got an oak woodland in the middle. And you can see that the trees are kind of coalesced together, and there's open spaces between the different stands of trees. And then on the right is a typical coastal scrub, which is a kind of a plant community within the shrubland category. And you can see it's just predominantly shrubs, and there isn't a tree in sight. Okay, of the 59 plant communities in our Tri-County area, most of us live in or near only 6. However, plant communities are further subdivided into alliances and associations, and you can think of these as variations on a theme. And these alliances and associations may also correlate to microclimates in our gardens. So if there's a let's say if you're in coastal scrub and there are certain plants that are in that coastal sage scrub community, there may be certain geographic areas within that coastal scrub community. So some may be right along or be nearer to the bluffs. Some of them may be further inland. Some of them might be in shade under a larger shrub. And so there might be some other plants present or a different combination of some plants present. And so those could correlate to microclimates in our garden, you know, with respect to, let's say, sunnier areas or part shade areas, okay? But the main takeaway here is that among our 6 communities, a lot of variety exists. And then within any single community or in transition zones or edges between different plant communities, a lot of nuances exist. So again, the takeaway is there are a lot of choices out there for our gardens. Okay, so this is just a vegetation maps and just another way to kind of visualize plant communities. So here we've got Monterey County, San Benito County, and Santa Cruz County. And then this circle, it's about a ½ mile in diameter in scale to the Santa Cruz map. And you can see, you know, there's 4 different colors representing different vegetation, all within a ½ mile of each other. And, or even a ¼ mile of each other, I could say. So the dark green is redwood forest. The orange is oak woodland, the light green is redwood forest, Douglas fir community, and the purple is sand parkland. And I didn't have a chance to look that one up, but I know that there are these really wonderful sandhill communities in the Santa Cruz Mountains. But again, the point or the takeaway here is that you've got several communities, or in some places, you may have several communities just within walking distance of your home or neighborhood. Okay. There are 2 online tools available to also help us make sense of our surroundings. So one is the California Native Plant Society Manual of California Vegetation, and the other is CalFlora. And we're going to look just briefly at the Manual of California Vegetation first. So this is a screenshot of the search page in the online manual, and you can search by tree, shrub, you can search by species name. And when I plugged in shrub, and then 50 alliances came up. And so we're going to look at the Arctostaphylos hookeri. And when you click on any of those alliances, you get this wonderful description. It tells you the character species. It tells you a little bit about, describes like the architecture of that plant community. It tells you the habitats, and it gives you other communities that are related to it, or where this species, other community groupings. Okay, and this is a map that is, I'm going to go back for a second. This map here is also on the search page. And you can click ecological regions. So the state is split up into different larger ecological regions. So you can think of it as ecoregions, plant communities, alliances, associations. And I just wanted to show you how the map works real quickly. So when you click on it, it's solid and it outlines just the general ecological region. When you hover over it, it's transparent so you can see more details about where you are. When you zoom in, what's really kind of cool is that you can really get a sense of what your neighborhood looks like. You can see topography, you can see not just a north or south facing slope, but on a south facing slope, for example, you can see how that slope is not just a horizontal smooth plane, it's actually, I don't want to say corrugated, but it has folds in it, you know, so canyons and so forth. So again, it helps you to visualize the potential for microclimates and why how plants aggregate, even if they're in the same community, why it is or how it is that they aggregate in certain areas based on climate and geological factors. Okay, CalFlora, just a different set of information that you can get there. And again, this is just to show, I searched on Archistaphylos and it shows me the areas, the climate areas of wherever I am on the, however I've zoomed in on the map, where it occurs. These dots and squares and so forth show where species have been observed. And you can also, you know, see what your soil is like. You can have shading come up on the map that might tell you your soil texture, which is really important to know how, do you have clay, loam, sandy soils or variations of these. You could also have a climate layer come in, and as with any of these soil parameters, the climate parameters will have different shadings to show different temperature ranges, different growing season lengths and so forth. So annual precipitation amounts. So it's kind of a cool thing. Both of these tools are can be helpful in visualizing and understanding on a general scale what's going on where you live. It's important to know that you always have to just know specifically what's going on with your garden, because what is happening in your garden is going to be different from your neighbor next door, even your neighbor across the street. Microclimates are just really, really important. All right, so we're going to go now to vegetation as architecture. And the technical word is physiognomy, and it just means how the vegetation layers, how much open, how vertical or horizontal the landscape looks. So here we're kind of got ponderosa pines and chaparral, and it's a more vertical community. Here we've got coastal scrub again, which is more of a horizontal community. And then within the vegetation, it may be very dense, or it can be very open. Habitat spaces can be vertical or horizontal, permanent or ephemeral. And by ephemeral, you know, things change all the time. So a storm may take out a branch, or plants for whatever reason may be, you know, may die, age out. Habitat can be ephemeral, but going from the ground up, you've got ground level plant litter, debris, leaves, shed branches, brush piles, and areas of bare soil for burrows or tunnels. You've got low plants such as ground covers, perennials, and shrub rubs. This is a buckwheat. And then here, this is a hummingbird on a ceanothus shrub that is probably about 8 feet, 7 feet high. And then you can even get more vertical trees and a huge nest here. Collectively, the plant species together grow with characteristic spacing, density, And depending on where they are geographically, different communities or associations, alliances, microclimates, soils, plants, may vary their spacing as they respond to what is around them, whether it's competition with other plants, whether it's, oh, there's a little bit more shade in this understory, or maybe there's a little bit more sun in that understory. Okay, so now we're going to go what it means to mimic a plant community. And mimicking a plant community in our garden is basically native plant species plus vegetation architecture. The goal is not to replicate a local plant community in your garden. The goal is to use native plants that are naturally found together and to arrange them in ways that create functional, self-sustaining habitat. And that habitat will provide food from the plants themselves or from insects or small animals the plants attract for larger predators, water, which for many species can be obtained from the moisture inside foliage and stems, areas for resting, protection from predators, nesting materials, and sites. And so what it means to mimic a plant community, I wanted to show a couple architecture garden analogs. So on the left, below, we've got a thicket of baccharis and poison oak, and there is a rabbit hanging out. And above that is a residential garden, and this is a thicket of creek dogwood. But you can see, the architecture is similar, and then they've added additional plants for additional layers. On the right, you've got a kind of a scrub planting of beautiful salvias and poppies and some other similar perennials that compose this particular bed for this particular garden. And that is analogous, not by plant species per se, but in architecture to coastal scrub in the lower right. And then these are just some garden examples. So on the left, this garden was on the Marina Tree and Garden Club tour from 2015. And this garden I particularly loved. You see non-plant features, so driftwood, rocks, in addition to the plants, and they've got a lovely collection of coastal sage, California sagebrush, Artemisia californica. I believe this is purple sage, if I remember right. And then down here, they've got a manzanita. This is actually looking from here in this direction, and they planted some coyote brush over here. And again, rocks and driftwood. So there's really lovely spaces for reptiles and small mammals to take shelter. There's spaces for birds. There are here, when this is in bloom, flowers for pollinators and hummingbirds. So it's a very rich habitat garden. Here on the right is another lovely habitat garden, but it's an example of another aesthetic approach. Again, you've got layers. So you've got these lovely manzanita shrubs, a redwood tree is here. You've got other lower natives, again, to layer the community. When I visited this garden as a student at Cabrillo College, this garden was still relatively new. So by now it will have filled in a little bit more, or quite a bit more. And then this is a kind of the vignette view and the use of a plant as a focal point. And so you've got a Western redbud here. And as you walk along this path, when you see this redbud in bloom against the redwood tree, it's just really beautiful and striking. So depending on your particular site conditions, you may find yourself drawing from just one plant community or two or three. And so what you want to do is select the local plant community that best matches each area of your garden. Some of your gardens, you just may be in an area that is full sun, and that's totally fine. Again, you may have sun and shade areas of your garden. So again, you can draw from alliances and associations to fill in. And, you can accent with other native species. Again, you don't have to replicate the architecture completely. You don't have to replicate the plant species completely. You just want plants that are compatible and that have habitat value. So once you identify plant communities that you'll be borrowing from, you can select the dominant species you like. So for example, in a redwood forest, redwood trees are going to be dominant species. In coastal scrub, Artemisia californica, coyote brush, monkey flower, lupins, depending on the scrub coastal sage scrub community, are going to be dominant species. And from a design standpoint, many of these are going to be the species that you will build your garden around. Then you can select supplemental species that are compatible. And then remember to combine plants with non-plant features such as boulders, logs, rocks, into different aesthetic groupings to provide habitat resources year round. Use vertical layers. Use horizontal spacing that is consistent with how plants occur spatially in the community you are modeling. And then lastly, make sure you have enough space available for each plant at its mature size. And there's a lot of reasons for that. As a pruner, when I see a plant that is, beautiful but too big for the space that it's in, you're always constantly, not constantly, but you're pruning it frequently. And in a habitat habitat garden, pruning frequently can, disrupt wildlife using the plant. Some insects in their larval stage hang out on stems or under leaves. And so if you're pruning quite a lot during the year, you're kind of constantly intruding and kind of disturbing the habitat. So aim to approximate, not to replicate. Build up your garden's resilience over time. One of the wonderful things I love about habitat gardens is that once wildlife starts visiting your garden, they're going to bring things to it. So they may ingest seeds from somewhere else, and then you'll, next spring, you're going to find out you've got a really cool other native, and you're wondering where the heck did it come from. So the garden will start to evolve on its own. And so engage with your garden with a lighter touch. And then I'm going to pause here and hand it over to Mandy. But before I do, let me check in with Trink if there are any questions that have come up in the chat so far.
Not that I see at this point.
Okay.
So we'll check in again later. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, then I'm going to hand it over to Mandy.
Okay. So this, as Carol was saying, this is just an illustration, black and white, of the different sort of ladders and layers that we're talking about in this presentation. So you've got the verticality with trees, the shrubs, you've got sunny areas and shady areas, logs and sticks and litter, rocks, water source, which could be, a bird bath, a pond, a little, some sort of water feature. So there. So shall we move on to the day trip?
Yeah.
Okay. So we are fortunate to live in an incredibly beautifully and richly diverse area of California. On a casual day trip, one can travel from the beaches of Santa Cruz or Monterey counties through dry or moist forests, along riverbanks buzzing with insects and a vast species of birds, to the open range of the oak woodlands with its own special habitat. We will begin this journey at the coast, where the coastal sage scrub plant community dominates the landscape. The largest human population in California lives in the coastal sage scrub plant community, putting considerable strain on this ecosystem. While both coastal sage scrub and coastal maritime chaparral are characterized by low-growing plants, they differ significantly in their plant types, which are determined by fire, moisture, wind, exposure, and soil. Coastal sage scrub is not adapted to withstand fire, and this feature leads to it being easily degraded into weeds and non-native grasses. Both these plant communities are well adapted to drought, though, with chaparral plants carrying small, tough leaves, and the coastal sage plants usually drought deciduous. Both communities grow in poor soil, being either acidic and sandy or thin and rocky with underlying clay or rocks supplying deep water sources. Where the coastal sage scrub habitat of buckwheat, sagebrush, coyote brush, salvias, ceanothus, manzanitas, and monkey flowers do not vary much in plant makeup, the inland chaparral plant community is very dependent on slope and aspect, with manzanitas, toyon, scrub oak, pitcher sage, and poison oak inhabiting moister north-facing slopes, and chamise, black sage, yucca, and bush poppy on the more arid south-facing slopes. The plants that are common to both these habitats but differ in species due to exposure are salvias and manzanitas. Deer, coyote, rabbits, reptiles, insects, and several bird species are common to both these communities. Of special note, the coastal sage scrub plant community attracts the largest diversity of endemic bees in North America. So now, having refreshed ourselves at the beach, we're now heading into the forest communities for shade and perhaps some quiet hiking. Density and verticality are the main characteristics that distinguish a forest from sometimes neighboring woodlands. With the exception of the mixed evergreen forest found mostly in the Santa Cruz Mountains of our 3 counties, the redwood forest and closed cone pine forests are dominated by one coniferous species. But all 3 forest communities have a diversity of overstory and understory plant species supporting a variety of wildlife. The woodland plant communities we are covering include, these forests require cool, moist days from the marine layer influence along with some sunny days. Redwood forests require more precipitation than the other 2 forest types for surrounding plant communities. Other trees found in the redwood forest in our southern range are Douglas fir, tan oak, bay laurel, and big leaf maple. Huckleberry, poison oak, ferns, and ceanothus are common in the redwood forest understory. Redwood trees are long-lived due to the tannin-rich bark and heartwood, as these tannic acids break down the proteins and other elements of intrusive pathogens and insects. The closed cone pine forests have the same variety of plants as the redwood forest with the addition of coast live oaks, but their presence is dependent on soil and climate conditions. Similar as well are the understory plants, and additionally, one will find coffeeberry, honeysuckle, blackberry, currants, wild rose, and wood mint. The vegetation of the closed cone pine forest is fire dependent, relying on infrequent but predictable fires, and the pine cones will only open and regenerate with the event of a fire. Monterey pines are the fastest growing species of pine trees, but they do not self-prune their branches well, leading to fire easily traveling into the canopy. So if you have pines on your property, be sure to prune the lower branches, especially if they are near structures. Our third forest type is the mixed evergreen forest that lie between redwood forests and oak woodlands, usually on the north-facing slopes or on the bottom of the canyon. These plants survive on intermediate rainfall and warmer, dry summers and present a softer and more horizontal appearance, largely due to increased photosynthesis from the larger leaves on the trees. This forest also offers more food sources for wildlife due to the greater diversity of plants within the range. Leafy trees and few conifers are dominant here, including big leaf maple, bay laurel, toyon, several varieties, oaks, coulter pine, madrone, and hazelnut in the overstory. The understory tends towards density with dogwood, ceanothus, and Oregon grape that can open up into clear areas where one may encounter Mariposa lilies, coyote mint, and ground cover Sonoma sage. The soils in all 3 of these forest communities tend towards being more acidic with compositions from sandy, loamy, and or overlaying clay. The health of these forests is compromised when development and residential urban landscaping leaches nitrogen into the soils, setting these plants up for disease and pathogens. Bay laurel is common to these 3 plant communities, as is huckleberry, ceanothus, and poison oak in the understory. The common wildlife in these habitats consists of squirrels, raccoons, Steller's jays, hummingbirds, woodpeckers, deer, owl, hawks, wood rats, deer mice, butterflies, and several species of insects and small birds. Our journey now continues to the woodlands, generally characterized by a more open appearance, but offering a rich variety of flora and fauna, very different from our previous excursions. The woodland plant communities we are covering include oak woodlands and riparian woodlands. The oak woodland by nature is patchy as it often subsists on less precipitation and inhabits hilly environments in the interior. And like the forest communities, it is adapted to a fire regime to maintain the health of the plant community. The oak woodland is dominated by coast live oak, blue oak, buckeye, madrone, bay laurel, toyon, and California walnut. The understory includes ceanothus, coffeeberry, manzanita, and poison oak, and may present as open and sparse or dense and well-developed. The oak woodland is of high value to wildlife, providing shelter, food, perches, cover, and breeding sites. The rich plant community of the riparian woodland is found along any river, stream, or natural waterway and provides the essential connection between aquatic and terrestrial environments, creating habitat that is found nowhere else in our counties. The riparian corridors can be dense with a variety of plants due generally to a regular source of water. The tree coverage is sparser than the forest communities. This riparian community presents a profile that can be open and vertical or dense and complex with many plants along the banks, which slow the flow of water, reducing erosion and increasing water infiltration into the soils that replenish aquifers. The large water-loving trees that form the overstory canopy in the riparian plant community are mostly big leaf maples, cottonwoods, alders, and sycamores. The understory brings rushes, sedges, willows, elderberry, blackberry, wild rose, and wild grape, among many other thirsty and lusher plants. Surprisingly, these two diverse plant communities both sport a large diversity of wildlife, but the water and nutrient-rich sediments from the repeated flooding in the riparian community wins hands down for the greatest diversity and productivity of flora and fauna of the 6 plant communities we are covering. Buckeye is the one common tree species found in both these habitats, while poison oak is the common understory plant encountered. You may have noticed that poison oak pops up in all these plant communities, which is kind of interesting. So it's a very hardy plant adapted to many of these communities. So the wildlife common to both these habitats are coyotes, foxes, bobcats, wood rats, amphibians, insects, several bird species, including raptors, but with a much higher diversity in the water-fueled riparian woodland. This concludes our mini day trip through these plant communities in our counties. Though most of us probably live in dense urban cities, there are plant choices we can make in our gardens to help create habitat, helping to sustain and preserve the wildlife that has evolved with the plants endemic to our plant communities. And are there any questions?
Not that I see at this point, but let me also ask Denise if she has seen any. Denise?
I have not seen any either.
Okay, well, I'll just start with a question myself, Mandy. In terms of the poison oak, I back up to an open space and I try to keep my plants at the rear of my garden or native. I do end up seeing some poison oak come into my garden. Do you have any recommendations in terms of a safe removal of the poison oak?
Well, goats, certainly.
Goats, yes.
We all have different reactions to poison oak. It doesn't bother me, but I know it can be severe with some people. I suppose you could suit up with, covering yourself well and taping seams and things like that if you're especially sensitive, and pulling it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a challenge, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm sure. It's it's amazing. It can be low growing. It can grow 40 feet up into trees. It can, yeah.
It's actually really beautiful when if you,
It is, yeah.
yeah, it's a gorgeous
And,
plant. I have a couple
and
very
incredibly, it's a wonderful habitat plant. The towhees often nest in poison oak. So
yeah, nice and safe from
yes,
humans anyway.
absolutely.
Let me ask another question. I know one of the issues that comes up in the native plant community is the mixture of non-natives in our gardens and their ability to kind of mix with the natives in biologically and then begin to change the native species. So do either of you have any comments about that and how we can begin in our own gardens to prevent that cross-pollination with the natives and our own non-native species?
Is it all right if I start in
Yeah.
on this?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to talk about just a brief mention of native cultivars later on in the presentation. So Trink, let me ask you, are you talking about native cultivars, or are you talking about non-native plants?
Well, I'm really talking about the non-natives somehow crossing with the natives. So maybe we should wait until you present this later and then you can address that.
Okay.
Either way is fine.
Yeah, what I can say about non-natives, in terms of if the species are closely related, I'm not a botanist, but I think if species are very closely related, I suppose that could happen. My concern and what I'm aware of is non-natives that are planted, they're low water, they're beautiful plants, but they can take over and outcompete the local native plant species. So the one that I'm, familiar with up in the Santa Cruz Mountains is Buddleia. I mean, it just loves riparian areas. So, and a lot of homes in the Santa Cruz area, even, in the hills just above downtown Santa Cruz, you've got, in that watershed, there are creeks that kind of flow through, everyone's backyards. And if you were to plant Buddleia there, it could, in theory, take off. So it is a known problem in riparian areas. And the best thing to do is to check with PlantRight website, one word, and we have that listed on our resources page. And the other is California Invasive Plant Council, Cal-IPSI, and they've got invasive plant inventories of what's causing issues in our area. And they have different inventories, so you can select horticultural plant inventory, and you'll get species that are in the horticultural trade that may be invasive depending on where you live. The other thing I want to say about plants that could be potentially invasive, it's really super important that if someone tells you, oh, this is invasive, you've got to find out very, very specific information about where it is invasive. To say something is invasive in coastal scrub or something is invasive on north-facing slopes is way, way too general. You need to know exactly where. So it's like along the coast, is it invasive along the bluff? And then you need to dig even deeper and say, well, where along the bluff is that species causing issues? So it's really important. I don't want to demonize any species. There are beautiful things offered in the nursery trade. The issue is where those get planted. So that's all I have to say about that at the moment. Mandy, do you have anything to add?
Oh, I can't think. I mean, certainly natives and non-natives, go together in terms of their, our need for drought tolerant landscaping. And yeah, I don't know enough about the crossing of them. So
Good. Okay, those are good answers. Thank you. There's another question here about whether the CNPS, the California Native, and the CalFlora websites, whether they offer suggestions on non-native species to use with the natives, because that's, I think, as we look at how to bring more natives into the garden, we kind of need those suggestions. And what do you two have? I don't think I've seen those on those websites, but what do you two have? And where else to find the combinations? I think there's some great nurseries that have some suggestions on those. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think certainly something like, a place like Sierra Azul that has that 2-acre gardens with natives and non-natives Mediterraneans is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. So, I mean, look around too. I'm not now thinking of the name. There's another nursery. We generally don't recommend nurseries, but just because we try to stay very neutral as master gardeners. But there, if you look online, there's another wonderful nursery, and maybe if somebody knows what I'm talking about, they can post it. That's in the Central California somewhere that has does a lot of natives, but they also make some great suggestions about non-natives as well. So anybody who has suggestions on that, feel free to post it in the chat. So I want you to continue, and we'll continue to watch for other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're up again, Mandy.
Continuing on the theme of integrating Mediterranean plants and native plants. So to create a garden favorable to wildlife and pollinators, there are certainly structural components and plant selections to be considered. Optimistically, 70 to 80% of your plant species should be California native plants suited to the plant community you live in and garden in. As discussed previously, you need to consider local microclimate, soil exposure, and irrigation. A goal of year-round flowering of plants that provide a variety of shapes and sizes of flowers and space for at least a square meter of the same variety, and a source of water for birds and insects. Ideally, you want to create a ladder approach that you have ladders or the layers. So you have trees for perching, feeding, and nesting, tall to low growing shrubs for food, cover, and shelter, and lastly, ground cover plants with some bare patches for ground dwelling bees. Though a completely native garden will provide the most benefit to the local diverse fauna and insects, there are several Mediterranean plants that provide an abundance of nectar and pollen for our pollinators. Some of these common plants are lavenders, salvias, herbs, zinnias, wisteria, nasturtiums, bee balms, sunflowers, coneflowers, asters, verbenas, marigolds, cosmos, and foxgloves. In general, bees are attracted to purple, yellow, and white flower colors, while hummingbirds favor red flowers. And while we generally like to keep a tidy garden, leaving dried seed heads on perennials until pruning in the spring will give overwintering birds forage through this lean time. And again, just having some patches of bare ground. I know mulch is emphasized a lot, certainly for suppressing weeds and keeping moisture in the soil, and that's good too. But it's good to have some bare patches for our ground dwelling bees, and again, rocks and plant litter. So any questions on that, Trink?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. But no questions on that so far. So let's, there's a couple of others, but we'll address them later. So sounds great.
May I chime in with a question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how big a bare ground patch should be, and how much square area is useful for pollinators, just the minimums.
Bare ground. I don't know specifically how much bare ground. I think certainly patches under low growing shrubs around some trees, sunny areas, shady areas. And we talk about a square meter for pollinators. It helps with their vision and also just being able to collect enough pollen to carry from one patch to another. So if they have an area that's big enough, they can, instead of having to keep putting energy into flying, if they can stay in an area to collect enough pollen. So.
Okay,
that
thank
answer.
you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. Is there anything else about Mediterraneans before we move on?
Not so much in the questions about Mediterraneans at this point.
Okay, thank you. All right, then we will go on to the next. All right, so this is considerations for your garden. And this is on in more detail on the basic steps handout, but I'm just going to go over a few things here. So I'll start with regulatory. Homeowners associations, apartment management companies may have restrictions on what you can and can't do, or what they want you allow in their developments. On the local agency level, county or municipal, it's always a good idea to check with your local urban forest or arboriculture department. There may be, especially for trees, a lot of these departments may have a plant list for trees that they want to use to restore the urban forest. So that's always a good thing to check. They also have really great resources on species that are suited to our area, both I think native, and I think they also have a really nice array of non-native for low water use plants. So they're a good resource, but in terms of trees, you don't want to invest a tree only to find out that in your city, they really don't want that tree planted. So that's important. If you are contemplating a water feature on your property, and this would be for people with larger parcels, at least 10 years ago and beyond, in Monterey County, let's say like Big Sur area, since the Tri-County area, I mean, we are just surrounded by environmentally sensitive habitat. So, you know, building or remodeling, you know, you have to go through a whole permit process and so forth. But there was a point where if someone was on a property, whether they did it or a previous owner put in a substantial sized pond, if a later owner wanted to remodel, or that same owner wanted to remodel or put on an addition and the pond was in the way, they might not be allowed to remove it because it's maybe considered a wetland type of feature. So if you're considering any kind of major terrain issues, please check again with your municipal and county planning departments just to understand the implications. And if you still want it, but the implications are not good, then maybe there are other ways, you know, put in, you know, smaller features, or, you know, have shallow trays with water, or bird baths or something scattered rather than a full-fledged pond. All right, so for site issues, I'll start off with soil. It is incredibly important to know what your soil texture is, you know, clay, loam, sandy. That is just critical. And the more I'm involved with the master gardeners and landscaping and so forth, it really, you know, continues to be brought home to me from a variety of different perspectives, whether it's native plants, whether it's irrigation. Soil is just so key. And then microclimates, that's, I guess, how I would rank them. I know there would be a lot of healthy debate about how you would rank those, but soil is really important, and we have resources so to help you figure out at home, what your soil texture is. Another issue for your site is just understanding, sun, shade, temperature range, hardiness range. You don't want to use a plant that cannot withstand frost or colder temperatures if that's the climate that you live in. Make sure you have space for the plants at their mature size as you figure out where you're going to lay things out. It is also perfectly fine. Everyone's working, a lot of people are going to be working with existing gardens. Just build up gradually. You don't have to do this overnight at all. Just gradually work toward a more habitat-friendly garden. With respect to wildlife considerations, for bird baths and so forth, make sure you add some pebbles, rocks. Some of the smaller birds, want to be able to perch above the water. Insects don't want to fall in and not be able to get out of the water. So make sure that your features are friendly to different scales of species. You also want to any feature that you put in, whether it's a bird box, a water bath, just make sure you know how to maintain it properly so it stays healthy for you and for the wildlife using it. And then if you have vegetable gardens and that you have netting or other things to keep the birds away, those are things that you're going to want to check regularly just to make sure nobody, whether it's a mammal or a little lizard, has gotten stuck. And then also with birds, you want to make sure on your windows that you have some sort of decal or something so that birds don't inadvertently fly into the window and hurt themselves, or worse, hurt themselves badly, that it's a fatal injury. And then back to problem plants, we discussed that already, so I'm going to skip that. And and the other thing about wildlife are pets. So if you have a cat and you want birds, make sure you keep your cat indoors, or that your cat just is interested in talking to the birds but not actually chasing or hunting them down. Here we've got a really cool bee structure. Mandy, can you talk about this for a second?
Yeah, this was at Foothill College. It was on the grounds with a lot of native plants, and it was just sort of an assembled structure with different size holes for different kinds of wild bees and other sorts of great little dwellings. But it was in this wonderful form of sort of a robot-y kind of structure. So anyway, it was quite amusing, but also very useful for wildlife.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And in the lower corner, this is just incredible. I've never seen deer actually sit down on someone else's garden. I always see them standing, but this is awesome. Okay. So special topics, and Mandy, I'm going to hand it over to you to comment on firescaping.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about ladders and in terms of structure and layers. It's just, depending on the size of your property, it's just being mindful of some very sort of wise choices in your plant placement and plant selections. And there are resources listed in our resource page that are very good, including one where you can type in your address and it tells you the danger of fire at your address. So basically with creating habitat where you've got layers, low growing ground covers, shrubs and trees, you want to keep your trees away from your structures. Trees, especially pines that are flammable, prune the lower branches up so that fire isn't traveling up from lower shrubs. You don't want to plant shrubs right underneath your trees. You don't want to plant shrubs right against your house. As much as we like to garden every square inch, you want to keep, as well as for termites, you want to keep the moisture away and keep lower growing shrubs close to the house and your taller growing shrubs a little bit further out. So, and like I say, the resources are quite good and explanatory. So, okay.
Mandy, there's a question about the website you were referring to on
Uh-huh.
safety. Could you give it to us so we could put it in the chat?
No, I don't. Let's see.
Well, we can just say that we'll put it in the chat when you find it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's on that resource page.
Oh, it's on the resource page. Okay.
Yeah.
Should have been sent 2 handouts when you were reminded of the meeting, and those are 2 resource pages. They'll also be at the end of this presentation. So when you're sent the presentation later, you'll have all of these references. Thank you. Carol, do you want to continue now?
Okay, certainly. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about garden care and just a brief mention about native cultivars. So with garden care, a few things. When you're prepping your garden for planting, planting in later fall and winter is really the best time to plant natives. But when you're prepping your site, if you have been using pesticides recently, make sure those have cleared your site before you plant. Pesticides, sometimes they might be still on the plant and could be ingested by your pollinators, your insects especially. So you want to make sure that's cleared. And obviously you want to use, non-chemical means whenever possible. And again, the Master Gardeners and UC Davis Integrated Pest Management website have great resources to learn about how to manage pests without using any harsh chemicals. The other thing is you want to weed before you plant. And in some cases, depending on how large your site is, herbicides might be a saner way to go than mechanical. It just really depends on how bad your weed problem is and how much area, how large the area is where those weeds are occurring. But again, make sure that herbicides have cleared, and you may need to put some soaker hoses out to leach the herbicides from the soil so that they are out of the root zone before you plant. Again, you do not want herbicides taken up by the plants either. And you do not want to purchase plants, whether natives or non-natives, that have been treated with pesticides, especially the neonicotinoid, the synthetic nicotine pesticide that many growers use. Just make sure you follow, keep your things chemical free before you plant. The other thing about garden care, again, I'll just I just mentioned again what Mandy discussed earlier about leaving leaf litter and, branches and so forth when possible and feasible on the ground. A lot of insect life shelters there, a lot of larvae develop there, and as I said, on the underside of leaves and on stems on the plants themselves. So again, time your pruning accordingly, and leave your garden as natural as you can. And what else here? I think that's it for basic garden care. You shouldn't need to fertilize your soil, and you don't need to amend your soil. And this kind of is counter to me, because from an irrigation standpoint, if your soil structure, how the different soil particles aggregate together, you want your soil to hold as much water as possible. But on the other hand, for a native plant, you're choosing from a community that's going to have similar soil to your garden soil. They already know how to deal with it. So from the native plants perspective, they don't need it amended. They get that the soil, is lean in nutrients. For the more arid communities like coastal sage scrub and chaparral and oak woodland. So they're used to it. And so you really don't need to do anything with fertilizer. Certainly you don't need to ever do anything with fertilizers, and you don't need to do anything with amendments. If you love a riparian plant, but you live in a scrub area, I'm sorry, but it just isn't going to work, okay? And the reverse is true too. If you are riparian and you want a scrub plant, again, it's not going to work. So don't fight yourself, don't fight the species, don't fight your geology. And the same is also true, many of you will have areas of your garden that for some reason, there's an area that's particularly moist, maybe the drainage in your neighborhood or in your yard, somehow there's always this muddy area. Again, the rest of your area may be suitable for scrub plants, but that little area won't. And if you wanted a riparian plant, that would be the perfect place for it. But many of our low water Mediterranean plants also like it dry and also like soils to be very lean. Okay. And going on to native cultivars, again, as with any plant that might be invasive, you need to be very, find out as much specific information as you can if a native cultivar might be invasive in your area. Again, I am not here, I do not want to demonize any plant whatsoever. It's really about, invasiveness is about, broadly anyway, about a plant kind of being in the wrong place relative to the other plants that have already been living there and adapted to those conditions. So that's, all that invasiveness means. It's not about demonizing a plant. Last fall's California Native Plant Society put on a symposium about genetics of native plants and climate change. And that the link to that symposium is on your resources page. But the huge takeaway from that is that they are recommending not to use native cultivars for those who live in the wildland urban interface. So if you're in town and you're surrounded by hardscape, you're going to be fine. But so many of us, and that's what makes our area so special, we're adjacent to wildlands, and we're within, pollen, seeds, can travel by wind or on other animals. So all I want to say is that for those scientists participating on that panel, the recommendation right now is if you live in the WUI, they really recommend that you not use native cultivars because, and this speaks to Trink's earlier question about potential for cross-pollination. Okay, and they don't know how climate change is going to progress, and it's this balance, like how do we preserve species, how do we preserve different populations of the same species where these populations grow in different microclimates. So there's always this balance between conservation and just being smart about how we move with climate change. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Are there any questions, Trink?
Yeah, do you want to take some broader questions at this point?
Can I just scoot ahead to the next slide just to see what's...
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so let me just go through this real quick and then I'll end on the last page and we can take general questions. So again, we have presentation handouts, resources. basic steps for habitat gardening. I just want to say generally, you know, the resources that we've talked about in the presentation and that are on the resources handout, the basic steps, please just take from it what works for you. You don't have to be precise or scientific with your garden. And everybody is coming to this from different backgrounds. So certain things are going to make sense, other thing and be useful, other things are not. So that's okay. We're not going to be offended. We just want to give you a wide range of tools so that you can come away with something that will hopefully be useful to you. And then these are our references. And then our closing thoughts, fences and property lines are our construct, not nature's. Think of your garden not as a space unto itself, but as part of and participant in a larger system of natural processes connected by the movements of wildlife. Thank you everybody for attending. And that's it for me.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if Mandy has any last
Yeah,
thoughts. Okay.
Thank you, Carol, for this great presentation. So
Thank you as well for your great presentation. So
Great.
Mutual Admiration Society for sure.
Yeah, wonderful presentation. Let me cover some of the questions that have come up, and there's lots of thank yous coming in the comments as well. So first of all, everyone responded very well to my question about native nurseries. And so you can see in the chat 5 or 6 different recommendations, everything from Yerba Buena and Half Moon Bay, Rana Creek, Blue Moon. Las Politas is actually the one I was thinking of, which is in Santa Margarita and San Marcos. And someone has also said that both Calscape and Xerces have nursery finders for natives near you. So that's a great recommendation. One of the questions was about ice plant in a community garden, and kind of quite invasive, as we know, and it can, in fact, this person is saying it works as a pretty good ground cover. Would you recommend they treat it as a ground cover or really try to just remove it fully? This is a community garden, so it might not be as directly related to natives.
right. I don't know how many millions of acres there are of ice plant that's so invasive, and there are so many better plants that could be used as ground cover. It would be my choice to pull it out and replace it with something more suitable. So
Great. Yeah. Okay, and then this is a good question about whether species and varieties of natives are as good as the original for native insects and birds. So once a species begins to change, is it as good for the native animals and birds as it is for its original? Do either of you know this?
Oh, go ahead. Mandy, do you want to start or?
no, I don't know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is a question that I've always that I've been wondering about, and research on. Let me clarify. Varieties are naturally occurring versions of species. I know it's a kind of an awkward way to say it. And then you've got the cultivars, and so the research into the varieties, I don't know, but because those occur naturally, I would think there must be some reason and some benefit. So I would imagine insects would be sort of co-evolving with those. Again, I'm not a botanist, but if a variety is occurring and its varieties sustain themselves, so there's got to be a pollinator out there that's allowing that to happen. So those would be fine. Cultivars are a little bit of a different story, and I did come across some research, and research about that is still very young, but there have been some interesting some interesting studies that have been done. Some of those studies find that the flower color might not attract the insect like the parent species did. some studies are finding that maybe the nectar, the cultivar produces more nectar or richer nectar than the parent species. So it's a mixed bag, and something that where there, as I said, the research into it, it's really kind of very, very young, and just started only in the last few years, but it's definitely a really interesting to follow.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, next question is about ground dwelling bees that have created a habitat in an area close to a walking path for this person. And is there any way that you know that they could safely move those bees?
Hmm.
Sounds like a hard question.
I don't know what chooses a bee to select one side over another. So I don't know how to answer that one.
Any thoughts from you, Carol?
No, I'm not.
Bee specialist.
Bees is something I need to learn about. Yeah.
The nice thing about master gardeners is we tell you when you don't know the answer. and
Can I address this question because I give California native bee talk. We have 1,600 California native bees in our state, alone in California, of different species, but they are in severe decline. So we need to understand that 70% of our native bees are ground nesting, other 3% cavity. So we need to, in their severe decline, basically probably put a barrier around that walking path and not disturb or try to move. The nest is important on the timing of the year. Native bees, after they're solitary bees, so they will come out in the spring and then start putting eggs in the nest and channels in the ground. So if one could make some barrier so that ground dwelling female can do her nature job.
And then when could they, when would be a good time of year for them to be able to either move it or just destroy the nest?
There shouldn't be any destroying involved.
So you're
there
saying
should just be consensus working around because our native bees are in such severe decline. But if they could let nature do its thing in the walking path, unfortunately, she chose that area. And if just a little temporary barrier so that her nest isn't disturbed, but also nature does take its course. If it is disturbed too much, she will find another area to start laying her eggs. So if you see that, and she could abandon it on her own also, but
right.
It doesn't mean every year she's going to choose that area because they don't live that long. So I would let nature take its course, but not disturb it. She might naturally move into a different location on her own.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that answer.
You're welcome.
Okay, and then questions around fire safety, about mulches and leaf litter, whether they should be removed as well. And I just did a quick lookup in the fire safety website that someone posted, the Cal Fire readyforwildfire.org. And it, as we all know from looking at fire safety information, they usually talk about zone 1 that's close to your home and then zone 2 that's a little further out. And there are recommendations to remove dead or dry leaves that are within zone 1. So, I think those of us, though, that look at many of our dry leaves around certain trees as a mulch, would be concerned about that. But once you get into zone 2, it also says any kind of mulch or dry leaves up to about 3 inches thick is still acceptable. So Mandy, Carol, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think, again, it's dependent on your location, size of your lot, your, whether you're really prone to fire. If you're in a city where your fire hydrant is down the street, I think it's probably not as important. And there's also gravel mulches too.
Good point.
Certainly. But if you're in a more rural, if you have a larger property, definitely you would want to be aware of those zones and what is in those zones and how they relate to your structure. So.
Great. Carol, anything to add?
No, I'll defer to Mandy on that.
Great. And I had a question on the best time to prune natives. One for you.
Yeah, for deciduous ones, okay, so woody plants, spring blooming plants, prune them after they've bloomed. For deciduous shrubs and trees, you can prune them in the winter. And for oaks, prune them late summer while it's still dry. That's important. Monterey pine trees, prune them. If you are going to prune them November to February. The bark beetle is inactive during that time due to the cold weather, so they'll have a chance to start healing. Or no, I'm sorry, start sealing their wound. For winter blooming plants, prune after they've bloomed. And for perennials, like the monkey flowers, salvias, plants that have, cane stems that come up from the crown of the plant, you can prune those after frost. And what you want to do is wait until you start seeing new leaves appear low near just 3-4 inches above the base of the plant. Once those leaves start to appear and you're out of, and your last frost date has passed, then you can start pruning them and cutting them to a node above the, the leaf that's, near the top, that's 4 inches above the base. What you want to do is make sure you've got several leaves on these stems so that you don't only have one leaf that you're relying on to regenerate for the spring. And there was something else I was going to say about that. Don't be scared to really cut them down to just 4 inches. There'll be a gap for a little while, but I promise you by May, they're going to be full-fledged and look absolutely gorgeous. So don't be scared of perennials. You don't have to be really precise in the cut. You just want to make a, basically like a 45-degree cut about a 1/4 inch above that uppermost leaf, and you're good to go.
Great.
So I hope that answers that.
I think that is a great answer. You did
Okay.
a great job on that. So very helpful. And let's see, just a couple of others. Many people are now creating mounds to plant various, particularly drought tolerance and maybe some natives. What do you think of that approach as a way to perhaps create a little different soil environment for natives?
Carol, your thoughts?
My first thought is, and I hope this is okay, Trink, Sierra Azul has these wonderful workshops and they do one on mounds, and I would really recommend everyone check in with their website. And I wish I could remember what they talked about with soil. My thought is that boy. I mean, mostly it's going to be Mediterranean plants, probably, which like lean soils, and California natives are going to like lean soils, likely are the ones that you're going to be using in the mound. I would just, my guess, and I don't know for sure, is that you would use, I don't know, Mandy. I mean, would you check like landscaping supply stores and just get something that just doesn't have a lot of, that's not heavy with fertilizer, or if it, to the degree that it does have fertilizer, that it's a slow release one?
Yeah, I think if you're talking in terms of adding soil in to create mound as opposed to collecting it from the property and to create a mound. Yeah, and I don't know about, adding amendments to get the proper consistency, certainly, for the plants you're putting in. And also exposure, are you planting in shade? Are you planting in sun? Is it a mix? What plants are you putting at the top? What plants are closer to the ground that are going to have a little more moisture? All those are things to consider. So,
Can I
And
speak to this?
hold on, let me just say that Sierra Azul is a good recommendation for this, just because they have some good information on this and they've done so many of them. So we do like to recommend places that we know have created have some good research behind it. So Sierra has a good handout on this if you want to, on mounds. And I've done one in my garden, and someone else here who is recommending a load of topsoil rather than some kind of mix. And that's what I used as well. Can work quite well. And if you don't have to make it terribly high of a mound too, it just give your plants a little start and then is able to work their roots into your native soil underneath that. So, but do look at Sierra Azul. That's a good resource for it. Thank you, Mandy and Carol. Okay, last question we have here is about collecting seeds in national forests. I think you've done both of you have done some seed collecting and propagating. Maybe Carol, would you have any idea about doing this in a national forest?
I don't know what the rules are for that. I mean, there are certainly seed collecting events that you can participate in. And then as far as whether or not they have enough left over to share, that's kind of up to the organization, the park and the organization. If you're a volunteer, donate some time, participate, and, that's always nice to do. But the only thing I'm aware of in terms of what's, legal to do is just to participate and find out if there are seed collecting events going on.
That's
because, yeah, they want to leave everything intact for, everything that's living in the park.
Yeah. And I would check with them. That's great. So, Carol, could you go on to our next couple of closing slides?
Certainly.
And as she does that, I again just want to thank Mandy and Carol for a wonderful presentation. And we look forward to perhaps more from them about natives in the future. I just want everyone to know that we would encourage you to go to our evaluation for this class. We're always looking to improve our programs, our individual classes, and the overall offerings that we do. So please go to the survey link, and we've put it there in the chat as well on this class. But we also, you will also receive a follow-up email survey from our statewide Master Gardener program. It's their effort to kind of learn how all of the different chapters of Master Gardeners, how the classes are being used by individual home gardeners. And this is helpful to us as we're raising funds for the Master Gardener program and showing the impact that we can have on home gardening. There's some additional classes coming up that we have here. Chicks in the City is tomorrow morning, and vermiculture is in another few days. And in July, we'll be doing a gray water. We would love to hear comments from you either in the chat or via emails about classes you'd like to see. And you can also put those in the survey as you do the survey. We are always looking for new classes, new topics, and would like to know what people are most interested in. We will be starting a new Master Gardener training program in next year, 2022, and we'll begin to take applications for those this summer and fall. So look for more information about that. And let's go to the next slide then. Carol, great. And this is just our last one to remind you all that we have a really wonderful hotline right now. We've gotten some new master gardeners involved in it and doing some wonderful research. So if you have a problem in your garden that you can't quite get the answer to, take some pictures of it, send us some pictures, send us some information about it. Do give us a little information. Where is the plant? What kind of soil is it in? You know, some background information, and we'll put our master gardeners on it and come back to you with some information. So you can always turn to us. So again, thank you, Carol and Mandy. Wonderful presentation. And great, Denise has just put in the Master Gardener link. And we will be back. You'll be in our mailing list. We'll send you more information about upcoming classes. Thank you, everyone, for a great program.